welcome to the studio here in Paris. We're talking about African metering solutions in the global context. Welcome, Logan.
Thank you.
How does Africa align itself with its infrastructure needs compared to the rest of the world?
It's a great question. I think having spent the last couple of days in Europe, what is very clear to me is that the dialogue in the African continent versus the dialogue here in Europe around infrastructure needs in the energy space is completely different. Europe has a priority around transitioning the sort of energy space to be more carbon conscious, whereas Africa is focused around delivering access to energy. If I look at global statistics around programs that exist today for energy infrastructure development, the conversation is around how do we bring access to energy between now and 2030 to around 650 odd million people in a sustainable context. If you ponder on that for a moment, you recognize that 9 out of 10 individuals in that space is in sub-Saharan Africa. So the priority, therefore, is very focused on the basic need, which is delivering access to energy.
So the prescriptive solution of one region doesn't necessarily fit another?
Not necessarily, not at all. I think for us, building on the context of these differing priorities, you get an impression of where one region is in that journey towards the ideal state of electrification versus where we are in Africa. I'd say we have elemental challenges to have to deal with first. And responding to access to energy sometimes means having to look at serving the basic need as opposed to measuring energy sort of support for consumers in Europe. By that I mean, if you look at technologies or solutions that are real and evident in Europe today, there's a lot of discussion around smart metering and what benefits that would create for the entire energy ecosystem. But then smart metering certainly has a role to play in the African journey. But the way I see it is it's going to play a role a little bit further down the line. Today it's how do we just meter the home? How do we bring a metering device into the home to allow consumers that very basic right to energy?
Of course, finance is the building block of any solution,
yes.
and the African utility needs to be self-funding. What are some of the challenges you're facing?
So I think for me, particularly over the last couple of years, what we've recognized is that there's certainly a role that sort of FDIs, banks, insurers have in supporting the finance needs of these projects. And for me, I think the primary nuance around that role is centered around sustainability. Having to look at the sustainable sort of outreach of electrification programs from a utility perspective as well as from an end consumer perspective. Ensuring that we choose the right technologies and we look at deploying those technologies, those systems, training utility users, training end consumers around the benefits of having access to energy, and then building on that over anywhere from a 10 to 15 year period. What we find on the African continent is that there's a very specific focus around generation projects, transmission projects, and very little focus is spent on the funding capabilities on the distribution and metering space. And for me, I think it's a bit of an oversight because if you consider the closed loop of the energy cycle, fundamentally you touch the consumer in the distribution space. The consumer has the means of supporting the entire asset base in generation, distribution, as well as transmission. By that I mean having to collect the revenue to support that value stream. if you don't necessarily place sustainable goals in the metering and distribution space, you run the risk of destroying value for the entire value chain. And I think, for me, what is vitally important for the investor, FDI and banking community is to consider what would be a sustainable means of bringing a solution together to support the entire value chain while keeping the end consumer and the metering device as a focal point.
So, of course, the silver lining to the African context is that you can take this leapfrog of all the developmental stages that other regions have gone through. You can go from a rural village to a smart city.
Exactly.
In one leap.
Exactly. And I think for us in Conlog, having defined our purpose over the last couple of years, we took the time to recognize what was happening in Africa. Certainly access to energy is a big priority. And there's specific roles that businesses such as ours have to play. Coming back to our value statement is, how do we create access to energy or access to resources by connecting people with resources? And that helped us sort of coin our purpose as a business. But looking more intrinsically at that statement, we get the perspective of having a sort of holistic view is vitally important. Ensuring that you are able to respond to the immediate needs of the consumer, the utility in that distribution space today, meeting those needs efficiently and effectively, but also looking at how those needs are so considerably different from needs across the globe. So you're quite right. When I look at the African population, it's a young, vibrant, highly energetic population that is gravitating towards technology at rates that it's phenomenal. Their ability to acquire and digest information off the internet is amazing. Their ability to transact and communicate sort of leapfrogs typical sort of banking and transactional elements that have been native to the Americas and Europe for many years. What we found is that there's a resilience about these people that almost drives the adoption of technology. So yeah, today we serve the basic need, access to energy. But in the very near future, we will address the needs of how do we create convenience for this population that is quite agile in their means to want to adopt technology. A particular example is the use of sort of mobile wallet applications in the non-bank sector in Africa for basic transactional needs. And we see that as almost a primary means of transacting for electricity tokens in your prepaid context, for engaging with mobile platforms to understand how their energy demands could be managed more effectively to support that very basic need that they've only grown accustomed to quite recently. So it's a very exciting time on the continent, and I think there's a massive drive from this young, energetic population to have to take advantage of the great technologies that exist out there. But I think we would certainly leapfrog a couple of the developmental stages that exist, that have existed in sort of more mature American and European environments.
Excellent. Thanks so much for your insights.
Thank you.
Be sure to subscribe to our channels for more industry-related content.